for those of you that don't know me, just let me tell you a little bit about my background, because I'm just one of you. I had never held public office before. I graduated from the Citadel, military college on the East Coast in South Carolina with a degree in electrical engineering. Went into the Air Force. I was commissioned as a distinguished graduate. Went into the Air Force. I intended to be a pilot, but God had other plans for me, because when I graduated, I had less than 20/20 vision. So instead of going to flight school with the rest of my classmates, they said, you know, you graduated. I was a top Air Force Cadet in my class, and they said, we'd really like to put you wherever you'd like to go. I had no clue. I'd grown up in Florida, went to South Carolina to school. I had no clue about the rest of the country, but I had just seen an Annette Funicello movie. So I said, I want to go to California. And that's where he sent me. So while the rest of my classmates went to Vietnam, I had to suffer through Southern California my time in the Air Force. But it was part of what, and I could lay out several other steps, but it's the thing that absolutely convinced me when I look back. When I started to run and I look back on my life, that God had made changes in it without asking me, that I didn't care about at the time, that I had no clue why they were being made, and I was really upset about it. As I look back, there was a very good reason for it. And so I am first of all, the first thing I serve is my Lord Jesus Christ as a Christian. The second is I am an original constitutional conservative. I believe that our founding fathers got it absolutely right, and that if we would just go back and follow what they wrote the way they wrote it, we would solve 99% of the problems we perceive that we have today because of it. And third, I'm a Republican. And if the Republican Party ever abandons God and boos God the way the other party has done, I'll just be a Christian conservative. So that's my background. After I got out of the Air Force, I worked in the aerospace industry for a few years, found that I just could not work in a corporate environment, and so I started my own business, ended up with an engineering consulting business that my wife and I ran up until a few years back. Matter of fact, just about the time we sold the business, we were living in Destin, Florida, at about 2 blocks from the beach. If anybody knows where Destin, Florida is. My wife, who is a native Texan, born in Commerce, raised in Ladonia, kids living in Rockwall, Texas. Grandkids came along, and she slipped me a note one day and said, this is the address I'm going to be at if you care to join me in Rockwall. So I left the beach to come back here. We ended up building I said, well, we cut a deal. I wanted to fly. I'm a pilot, and commercial instrument, multi-engine rating, and I just wanted to fly, so I knew there were air parks in Texas, and so I cut a deal that we would be within 45 minutes of the grandkids if we could live in an air park where I'd have my airplane in the hangar next to the garage. So we did, and that's where we lived. And so that got us back here, and we were going to go do mission work. We were qualified with Southern Baptist Disaster Feeding Units, Texas Disaster Feeding Units, and I had just gotten qualified with Angel Flight. Those who are familiar with Angel Flight, those that own airplanes, donate their time and all the cost to transport patients who cannot fly on a commercial plane, either can't afford it or shouldn't be on one. And that was what we were going to go do. And I ended up going to a Tea Party meeting, one of the first in East Texas. And out of that meeting, I read a couple of books, 5,000 Year Leap. If you haven't read that, I highly recommend it. And a couple of other books, but most of all, I got a guilt complex. And the guilt complex I got was that I come, like many of you I see sitting in this room, come from the greatest generation. Father, grandfather, uncles, and aunts were the people who lived through the Depression, took up arms, took on the 2 biggest armies in the world, have no clue how the outcome was going to be. And, you know, there was no cell phones in those days, so they disappeared with weapons left over from World War I to start it off. And at the same time, our home front turned to women came out of the kitchen, they came out of the classrooms, they came out of wherever they were and traded in their aprons for welding gloves or building ships or building tanks or doing things that women had never done before. And that nation gave up some of the niceties, went on gasoline rationing and tire rationing and other things. And when we got through the war, we didn't conquer anybody. They didn't conquer anybody. They just they just advanced freedom and liberty and helped the nations rebuild, came home, the war fighters came home, they put away their weapons, climbed on their tractors, picked up their shovel, picked up their briefcase, whatever it was, just went back to work. And women came out of the factories and went back to doing things a little bit differently than what they'd been doing for a few years there. And we didn't have much debt, but we had God in our schools, God in our courts, God in our governments, God in our homes. And then my generation took over. And look at the mess we made of it. Absolute mess we made of it. And that first Tea Party, when I saw the tag that was hanging around my good friend Doc Collins's grandson's neck, it was a big brown tag, and I'll never forget it. At that time, it had $48,792 written on it. And I said, what in the world is that, Doc? He says, that's how much he owes in our national debt. At that time, it was about $16 trillion. Today, it's over $20 trillion in there. And when I saw that, I realized that what our founding fathers talked about of taxation without representation was child's play compared to what we are doing to future generations. The debt we have incurred for future generations that will take 5 or 6 or more, if we were just to stop deficit spending and started paying off, it would take several generations to pay it off. And that is debt, that's unpaid taxes that those kids are going to have to pay. My kids, your grandkids, grandkids got to pay for our excessive consumption. And then many of the other things that I won't go into. And so I got the bug bit, and I started organizing tea parties all over Texas. My wife thought I'd lost my mind. I would get in the car and drive for, who knows, 3-4 hours to a group that said, we're thinking about starting a tea party, can you help us? And we did. We got several of them started, and then we moved in and realized that the issues we were fighting at the time, and I'm saying all this before I get into this because we're about to come into a perilous time, and I really want everybody to understand that we have got to re-energize ourselves here. But what we realized when we were fighting issues, when we kept writing about issues and protesting things, we said, you know, those issues will always be there. We will always have issues to deal with. Our problem is that, like our founding fathers intended, we don't have righteous people in office. If we put the right people in office, these issues will go away. We'll still have some, but the really bad ones will go away. So we started working. In 2010, we got a good number of people elected. 2012, we got some people elected. And as we went through the list of those that were on the far left that wear the Republican costume, and for those you don't realize it, not everybody who wears a Republican costume in their chest beats the heart of a Republican. Many of them have the heart of a Democrat, and that's just the way it is here in Texas. But my predecessor was ranked as the most liberal Republican in Texas by multiple organizations out there, and had some horrible bills that he had sponsored. And I spent 2 years trying to find somebody to run against him, and nobody would do it. I talked and I talked and I talked, and then people that should have just wouldn't do it. And so, out of frustration, my wife and I talked about running, and we prayed about it. We talked about it, prayed about it. She told me later that she was saying, dear God, don't let him go do this. Please don't let him do this. But we decided, you know, if not us, who, and if not now, when. And we turned it over to God and said, okay, if you want us to run, you give us what we need, and we will do it. And that came after I tried to ask him for some money and for some people and things like that. And the message he gave me back was, you think you need to tell me what I need to do if I want you to win? And I said, okay, you just do it. Just give me the words. And the only thing I ask for is when it's over, that we have peace. I don't want to be bitter. I don't want to be mad. I just want to go on to the next mission, whatever it is. So we will take, you know, whatever you do. And so he didn't give us, he had a sense of humor. He didn't give us any money. We raised about $12,000 in the primary. My opponent spent $500,000. And, but he gave us a lot of really good people. We battled it out. We got into a runoff. And in the runoff, there were a little over 30,000 votes cast. We won by exactly 300 votes. To remind you of any story in the Bible, Gideon, God said, you know, I don't want you to think you won this battle with 30,000 people. I'm gonna give you 300, you go win it, and you'll know who did it. So that's how I got here, and when I get to the rest of the story, you'll see the turns and twists that took place. That started with me absolutely assured that I was going to pilot school because I was going to be one hot-shot fighter pilot, and then to be told I was going to go be an engineer on the Minuteman Missile program.